Do you want Instagrammers or TikTokers to post about your brand? Or do you actually want to engage creators who influence their audience to buy your product? If you're in the latter of those two, you've come to the right place. Welcome to Winfluence, the Influence Marketing Podcast. Hello again, friends. Thanks for tuning in to Winfluence, the Influence Marketing Podcast. Whether you are a creator or represent a company, agency, or other stakeholder in the influencer marketing space, you have a brand. It may or may not be a good one, or at least one that is well defined, clearly communicated, and the like, but you have a brand. If you haven't articulated what that brand is, you're kind of leaving it up to those around you to define or even assume what it is. The more you can articulate what that brand is, what it stands for, what it strives for, the better chance you have of recruiting fans and followers. If you are rather extreme in defining it, you can evolve that brand following into a brand community. What if I told you there was a process to branding that is so relevant to the influence marketing world that YouTube requires its study for employees so they understand how to build audience and advocacy both for YouTube and for the YouTube creators they might help along the way? Well, there is. It's called Primal Branding, and it's the brainchild of Patrick Hanlon. Today on Winfluence, we're going to dig into what Primal Branding is, how you can apply its principles to your brand, whether you are a personal brand content creator or a marketer for a company or product. We'll look at the case studies of Primal Branding in action. I'm sure there's a big one you know well, but just don't know it's Patrick's work. And we'll dig into how it can solve some of the world's biggest marketing challenges. Primal Branding is coming up on Winfluence. This episode of Winfluence is presented by Scipio.ai. We help brands solve a couple of big problems. We also have free solutions for creators that you need to know about too. For the brands out there, what we do best is source authentic and high-performing user-generated content you can use to fuel your paid, owned, earned, and shared content strategies. UGC performs better. We help you get as much of it as you want. If you also want to use those users to post the UGC on their channels to become influential voices for your brand, our software helps make that happen too. For you creators, when you authenticate into Scipio.ai's platform, we have a free media kit you can use to market your influence, your content, and your channels to brands. You can customize it, then pop out a PDF or a web version to share. You can even create different versions for different clients on the fly. We also have an incredible referral program that pays you 20% commission on the first year's revenue from any brand you refer to Scipio.ai. You can learn more at Scipio.ai, and if you'd like to set up a call with me personally to show you the platform and how it can benefit you and your brand, whether you're a brand or whether your brand is a creator brand, jump over to jasonfalls.co/Scipio. Fill out that form and we'll set up some time to talk. That's jasonfalls.co/Scipio. Scipio.ai. We're building a community commerce marketing super app that has something in it for you and your business. Come see us. If YouTube requires its employees to read up on Primal Branding, I figure we should too. Patrick Hanlon is next on Winfluence. Patrick, it's great to have you here. I've been a big fan of your work for several years now. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of Primal Branding, give us the origin story. How did you get from where you began in the world to becoming someone changing the way companies and organizations think about themselves?
Am I changing the way they think about themselves? That's good. It's hard to know from this side of the fence. As I started out advertising, I was a creative director and so forth on Madison Avenue and elsewhere, a couple other places around the country, working on large brands. I always tried to work on things that I didn't have to explain to my mother what they were. And so, UPS and a little bit on IBM and John Deere and the things that were great at that time. And writing Super Bowl spots mainly. And then I had this idea. People at that time were talking about Nike tribes and Apple cults, but no one really knew how to do that for themselves. Advertising really didn't have anything much to do with that. Sometimes it did, but let's see, Starbucks and Google at that time were crossing the continent. And this was so we're going back 1,000 years ago, to 2001, basically. And Google and Starbucks were becoming popular, and they did not use advertising. So obviously there was something else going on and no one knew what it was. And so I had some time to figure it out and came up with Primal. Until someone shows you the Big Dipper and the North Star, you don't know that they're there. You can't find them. Yeah. And so people have been doing this. The brands that I point out as examples immediately at that time were Apple, Starbucks, Coca-Cola, and other big brands that everyone, Nike and so forth, the usual. But this really put them together. And so now that I've identified what I call primal branding and the 7 pieces of primal code that go into primal branding, people can do this much more intentionally and with conviction and be committed to it, and which people have not been and still aren't. And so once you identify the 7 pieces of code, which are the creation story, creed, icons, rituals, sacred words or lexicon, special language, basically, ice grande, skinny decaf latte, non-believers, and then the leader, you can intentionally not only identify those things for your own enterprise, but which is especially important when you're starting up or launching a new product, but also if you are trying to reimagine yourself, even if you're a 100-year-old brand. And so you can line those things up. You create what we call a strategic brand. Those 7 pieces are called primal code. You line those up, and that creates what we call a strategic brand narrative, which you can then distribute across social, digital, and traditional media. So where does my creation story go? Does it go on Facebook? Yeah, probably. Does it go on the back of the pack? Maybe. If you're an Italian restaurant, it goes on the menu. Yeah. Or does it become a movie? Last summer, there were so many movies and things on Netflix that were in Prime and out in the theaters that were backstories behind how did they make The Godfather, all backstories, creation stories. And people always think that the creation story, who cares? I know you don't say that, but you kind of explore creation stories a lot.
Right.
Like to. And actually, either the guys who wrote Positioning, everyone knows what positioning is, I think. I asked them to review the book, and one of them said, the creation story is, why you should buy the book to find out about that. It's the basis behind creating great brands. So when I talk about brands, I'm not necessarily talking about Coke, Nike, Apple, Starbucks, Google, whoever. I'm really talking about the community that surrounds a product or service. That is your brand, not the logo, not the website, not your name. So it's what Primal has done is really totally flipped the traditional model.
So did the idea come from analyzing the Nikes of the world, the Starbucks of the world, the Apples of the world, or was it informed by a bunch of other things? I'm just curious how you really got into, to borrow a term, sort of the lexicon and those 7 items, and where did that come from? I'm sure you did a lot of research and thinking about it, but where specifically did you explore to come up with this whole concept?
Yeah, I explored it while working in my backyard in Connecticut. Actually, I was working on Lego. They had a problem and they were going out of business. I was a global creative director, so I was able to go to Billund, which is the company headquarters. I was able to go to London, which was the European headquarters. I was based in the US. I went to Legoland out in Carlsbad. So I was able to see more of Lego than probably a lot of the people working at Lego. And I just felt in my gut that there was something slightly wrong about it. And at the same time, a McKinsey consultant was going through the spreadsheets, and he told the family that if they kept on doing what they were doing, they'd be out of business in 2 or 3 years. And so I didn't know about him until later and what he was doing until later. Nevertheless, I started to think about, why do we believe in some or trust some companies in their products and their services and not others? And well, what do they all have in common, all the major brands, especially the Google and Googles and Starbucks of the world? Well, they all have a logo. The first thing I thought of was the Nike swoosh, right? And then, well, they all have some kind of creation myth. Apple started in a garage. Nike started out of the trunk of Phil Knight's car, etc. And Google started in a dorm room, and so did Facebook and all of that, right? Mm-hmm. And so the launch of these new tech companies was particularly fascinating at that time. We're talking about 2001. And so I just went through them. And what else is there? Oh, they all have a special language. Ice grande, skinny decaf latte, iMac, iPad, iPod. And they all had a creed: think different, just do it. E pluribus unum, semper fi. They all had non-believers. And I grew up during the so-called cola wars, which then became the burger wars, which then became, everyone had a war, PCs versus Macs, right? And so there were rituals and so forth. And so the ritual at that time was people were not having coffee at home. They were going to Starbucks and paying $3, my God, for a cup of coffee, when they usually would pay 50 cents or $1 or something. And then the leader, and I think that's all 7, right? And so I just pulled all these together, and I thought maybe there's something else, because this was kind of compilation. They kept compiling, adding up, and decided no, that was pretty much it. The result of all that is that people belong. Someone cited that as like the 8th thing, but that's really the result of it. And Leaves talks about that in his book, The YouTube Method. But once you pull all of those together, you can deconstruct your brand, your company, into those 7 elements and decide if you have them or not. And it's not just enough just to have them, Jason. First of all, know what they are. But secondly, you have to keep them relevant. And so you have to keep them energized so that people are excited about them.
Right.
And or talk about them in different ways through the different media, digital, social, and traditional media. And by traditional media, I don't mean, of course, advertising, television advertising or anything, but the outdoor public relations, PR is incredibly important these days. Getting an article written about you is amazing. Doing podcasts, etc.
So the primal branding, the primal code, if you will, it's more than just a mission statement and core principles. Why do you think that line of business strategy stopped there? You obviously took it a lot further, but until this sort of coalesced for you, I think we were saying, oh, let's make sure we have a logo and we have a mission statement and we maybe have a tagline and maybe we have our core principles.
And let's go.
Yeah. Why do you think it stopped there?
Because I think that traditionally it was marketing by rote. I mean, the old way of doing things in 2001 was basically, this varies by whatever category you're in, right? But basically every year you would come up with your marketing plan and a couple television spots, depending on how big your budget was, some print ads, a radio campaign. Someone else would be doing some direct marketing, direct mail. But the big thing was television advertising, because that's what brought the mail home, And so you pulled those together and you went off to play, you organized your golf games, your golf schedule. And then you met the following year, you kept track of what was going on, obviously, and might have to correct something during the course of things. But then that was basically it. It's much different today. Today, it's moment by moment.
Yeah, that's very true. Okay, so you talked about the 7 pieces of primal code a little bit: creation, story, creed, icons, rituals, lexicon, non-believers, and leader. What happens if you sit down as a brand and you look at those and you don't have one or more of them? What do you do?
Figure out what it is. Yeah. Like, for an example, the toughest one is, we all know Halo, right? The game. Yeah. First person shooter, the Xbox game. We had a session with them where we had a primal dig with them, which is what we call our sessions, our workshops, where we deconstructed the brand when we got the creed, which is what you're all about. Why do we exist? In Simon Sinek's terminology, it's the why, which is just one piece. We talked for 3 hours about why they existed. Here was a $1 billion company, $1 billion franchise. The Porsches were parked in the parking lot, Ferraris, and these guys were 8 guys were talking about why they came to work in the morning. And it's very interesting. So my point is that the creed is usually the toughest thing to come up with. And a lot of times it's winnowed down, been distilled by copywriters who distill it down into 1 to 5 words, and sometimes that takes a lot of time. Just do it, came out of a movie. think different. Came out of a situation where Apple didn't have any products to sell. Apple usually, customarily only advertised when they had a new product coming out. And they would advertise that product because they did not have a large budget at that time. And so there's nothing else. So just think different. What was the commonality between all the people that were in the Apple cult at that time,
Yeah.
And so they thought differently. And so that's really the toughest thing. And really the creed, I mean, the mission statement is fine, but the mission statement is really, it's not really the creed. That's really, the mission statement is like the vision of what you intend to do.
Right.
And the creed also is sort of a thematic distillation of that.
Very nice. We are talking
Vision
to
statement, much
Patrick
more.
Hanlon about primal branding. When we come back, we're going to focus in a bit more to see how it applies to the influencers and content creators out there. Talk about some of the examples of Patrick's work you probably know, but just don't know it's primal branding in the wild. Don't go away. Welcome back to Winfluence. We're talking about primal branding with its originator, Patrick Hanlon. So, Patrick, when we went through the 7 pieces of primal code that make up the building blocks of success, I was thinking I'd love for you to put more of a fine point on all that for individual content creators and influencers out there, the personal brands, if you will. I think we get that branding principles apply to them
Sure.
because they are building brands, regardless of the individual or media platform focus they might have. But what do you say to the content creator out there looking to adopt these ideas? How does it apply to them?
For them personally?
Yeah.
As personal brands? Sure. And you have to align these things carefully for yourself because, like, where do you come from is your creation story. And what we're really trying to do there is to build credibility and some sense of what you're doing or where you're from. And we want to know where you're coming from. Are you a good guy or a bad guy? And so that's what your creation story is about. Doesn't matter where you were born or what kind of family you had. Maybe it depends what you're trying to build. One exercise we ask clients to do a lot of times is to write a headline. Imagine they're a journalist and it's 10 years from now. And they're writing for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Huffington Post, Wired, whatever you want it to be. And what's the headline? And so that kind of gives you a horizon line. And then back everything off from that and reverse engineer it in a sense. So what's your creation story then? Where are you from? What are you all about? How do you do things? What's your process? What do you like to do? What do you don't like to do? Who are your mentors? Who are your heroes? If you're in design or film, making movies, or you're a director, who are the directors that you admire? Who are the designers you admire? Who are the writers? If you're a writer, what kind of writing do you like? And so by doing that, you basically fill in all the pieces of primal code. Here's where I'm from. Here's what I'm all about. Here's the way that I like to do things. Here's how you know it's me. You're wearing big glasses and I have a hat on or in a beard, or you don't. You have some other thing going on. And just so they know that it's you, right? And so you pull all of that together. And here's what I'm not and don't want to become. Set that up pretty clearly. And there you're the leader. And so once you do that, you're able to ping. That's important because once you do that, you ping both the rational parts, the checklist that your brain has, but also the emotional parts of our brains that help create desire and preference. And so when you do both of those things together, people prefer you.
Yeah.
In popular jargon, they have their shit together. Right.
That's
And if you have your shit bet is more together than the person before you or after you or your product or service,
right,
whatever you're branding around or trying to build a community around, then you win. And that's been one of the side effects of working with some of the Fortune 50 companies that we've worked with is that every year, Johnson & Johnson, Kraft, Levi's, and others, they have hundreds of different projects going on, programs going on amongst all their brands. Some of them get money, some don't, some of them get the go away money and others become well-funded. And our projects got funded because the teams that we were working with were able to say, hey, this is where this product is coming from. Here's how it came about. Here's what it's all about. Here it is. Here's how you know it's us and not someone else within the brand architecture. Within those companies, you don't want to steer into someone else's lane. And here's the way that we're talking about it. Here's what it's not. And here's the team.
Very good.
Sign me up.
All right. So, for unbeknownst to the listeners and the viewers out there, I asked Patrick to do a little prep work, a little homework for the interview today, because I thought it'd be really interesting to take an example that the audience can really understand. So, Patrick, just for shits and giggles, for anything else, when you look at the Winfluence brand, my brand, which the audience understands, I'm curious, am I hitting or missing anywhere? And I'm not asking for free advice so much as I know the audience understands what this show is and who I am. They're familiar with the example. Anything stick out when you see Winfluence as maybe an opportunity area for me, a problem area for me, just to give them an example of what sort of doing an audit for my Primal Branding is?
Yeah, I don't know that I know Winfluence as well as some of your listeners, but I think you go into creation stories. I don't know if you've gone into your own creation story. So maybe some of the listeners have been checking off the boxes for you as we've gone through anyway. But what is your creation story?
So my creation story is for the Winfluence brand really is that in all of my work in influence marketing, public relations, marketing, etc., I have seen the market demonize influencers, particularly just using the word influencer. It's not really, but they demonize influencers because they think of them as very superficial, ineffective, etc. And the whole concept of Winfluence is I came up with this idea that influence marketing without the R means you're focusing on influencing. You're focusing on the verb. You're not focusing on the person or the channel. And when you do it that way, it opens up the blinders and the guardrails so that you can see all of the possibilities of influencing audiences. And it could be through social media creators, but it could also be through local community leaders or grassroots groups or nonprofits or associations and things like that. And so my whole creation story is I see the world of marketing looking at influence marketing in a very opaque way. They're seeing one side of it. They're not seeing the whole picture. And I'm trying to get them to kind of turn that open a little bit so that they can see it's not about influencers. It's about influencing. And so that's kind of the idea that I sort of launched this whole book and podcast upon.
Yeah, I think that's one way to look at it. I think that the thing about influencers is that people were not influencers and they tried to hack the thing or kind of trying to game the system. So that gave everyone kind of a bad name, I think.
Yeah.
And so the influencers are really the old school way of that was celebrity endorsements. So basically influencers are celebrities who are endorsing a product, probably, right? And once you see that within that mindset, well, you may have 100,000. Influencers really gave advertisers a low-cost way of having a celebrity endorsement.
Yeah.
So it's one form. And I think that it's important to point out that in the US, you need to be in 5 different kinds of media or whatever. People need to hear about you in 5 different places before they can say, yeah, I've heard of them.
Yeah.
Okay. And so influencers are just one of those. Right. Of course, if it's Beyonce, then you only need one, probably. But,
probably, yeah.
But I think that's important is that here's how we fit into your marketing mix. And a lot of marketers may not know that they need 5 because there are 10, but some of them do need to know that some startups, smaller brands who are starting out, and there are a lot of those out there. And so that's your way in, I think. It's not debating what kind of influencer you are. It's, hey, you need to be in 5. And by the way, and that's for people taking notes, that's from Edelman PR company, global PR company, that stat. And the other stat is that it takes 100 hours to make a friend, which you can Google. A couple social scientists came up with that 2 or 3 years ago. So between the 5 different places and the 100 hours to make a friend, because you're trying to build relationships, right? It gives you a sense of the breadth and the depth, 4D, whatever that is. It dimensionalizes the whole thing. And so that, I think, is the influencer's way in to budgets of most organizations out there. So the message really is you can't really just rely on influencers. You have to be in other places as well. Sure. But influencers are a low-cost method of getting yourself out there for word of mouth. Yeah. And the thing is that marketers, everyone wants to go viral, which is like winning the lottery. And your chances of going viral are very slim. That's kind of the hustler's, game. And even creators like Mr. Beast don't know if it's gonna hit or not, right? And
That's true.
he tests it first. And so here's a weird example, but the best-selling record I think of all time is Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and the Comets back in the 50s, right? Rock Around the Clock. And they didn't know that was going to be a hit. It was actually the B-side of a 45 record, little tiny records that they used to have. Yeah. And it was the B-side, not the A-side. So nobody knows what's going to hit. But anyway, back to influence. What is your creed?
What is my creed?
What's your just do it?
My just do it is focus on influence, not influencers. Like, I think it's that simple to me. I don't think, obviously not put a lot of thought into it about having a creed, but I think it's really about, broaden your perspective on what you're trying to do here.
Well, the creed is your reason for being. And so you have to figure out, how do you differentiate yourself from other people who are more or less like you, right? And how do you differentiate yourself vis-a-vis the other forms of content that are out there that are non-influencers? Everyone wants to be influential in their stuff, but that's generic. But to figure out what your creed is. And then the icons, all the people that use Instagram, that's where your icons go, the visual ones anyway. The other point to make about icons is that icons engage all the senses, not just sight. So sound, touch, taste, smell, etc. So whatever you can do in terms of that is awesome. And then the lexicon is rather specialized, right? With influence, etc. And the non-believers. So who are the non-believers? People who don't believe in influencers.
Very true. Yeah.
They don't want to use influencers in their media mix for whatever reason, because of scams, or they don't have the budget for it, or it's not their thing because of their category or whatever. And then the leader is you. So then your challenge, your opportunity really is, how do you distribute all those? We have those all written down, parsed out. Where do you distribute those across social, digital, and traditional media so that people who belong to your community feel like your only mission, Jason, is to tell people and remind them what those 7 things are, distributed throughout the media. So they're already opted in, right?
Yep.
And so that they feel like they are a member of your community.
Nice.
And so that when other people, because they will spread the word for you, they are your marketing tool, essentially. And they will, anytime someone comes along and tries to say, troll you, then they will defend you. And you need to give them the sound bites. So it's important to say, well, why should I be using Winfluence when I'm using this other thing?
Right.
Well, what is it? That's what you have to work out. What do you feed back to them? So you try to get it down. We have 3 versions. The matchbook cover version, think different, just do it. Invent for HP when they were using Invent. Invent was interesting because for Hewlett-Packard HP, because people coming in to work every day knew what they were supposed to be doing, what was important at HP, Invent, and consumers, the outside world, also knew what they were up to, right? Yeah. So it was reflexive that way. So that was cool. Yeah. Another one like that was, it's an old one that UPS used to have, was "We're the tightest ship in the shipping business." And that was reflexive because UPS understood where they wanted to go. Their vision was really to become the global logistics supply chain shipper, which they eventually became. But at that time, they knew that they needed to fine-tune their operations and become the tightest ship in the shipping business. They weren't when they ran that line, but they became that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So, speaking of examples, I did want to touch on this because I love the examples of your work out there in the wild. If I'm not mistaken, Primal Branding is largely responsible, I believe, for the world not using the term global warming as much these days. Is that correct?
We worked on that, yeah. When the company was Thinktopia. Yes, we worked on that. We did not really use Primal Branding against that, I'd have to say, although that was just one specific piece, the creed. And I didn't work on it personally. People that I worked with did, but because I thought it was sort of a cop-out. to move from global warming to climate change is sort of a cop-out, I thought, political cop-out, but it worked, right?
There you go. Well, I love that example.
But yes, we did.
Yeah, I love that example also because I think people don't often easily realize that it's not just consumer brands that are practicing these things. It's people like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, governments tap into branding and communication strategies. And even in primal branding type work is going to help them as well, right?
We helped create, we didn't, people used the primal concept to create a top 10 album a couple years ago for a celebrity that we would all know, you would all know, some may know. We also worked with the Conservancy in Kenya, in Africa, just using primal branding with zero money. And we joked that if someone wanted to talk to the marketing director, brand manager, they'd probably get the cook. And they had zero money. So we called in some favors and someone redid their logo for them, which needed to be done. But the point is, in 2016, Nabosho Conservancy in Kenya won the African Global, that's the Ecotourism Award, using with zero money for a budget against all the airlines, all the hotels, all the other conservancies, and luxe camping things. That was fun. So you don't need any money to use Primal. You just need to go through the 7 pieces and figure out your own code. It's the root code for building communities.
Excellent. Well, let's make sure people know where they can go to find all these resources. Patrick, the book, the website and such. Tell people where they can learn more about primal branding on the interwebs.
Sure. The book is on Amazon. And you can go to our website, obviously, primalbranding.co, but also Instagram at Primal Branding, where we try to put something up there, not every day, but at least once or twice during the week. And that's where we try to feed all the new things that we've been learning as we go along through this process.
Very good. Well, we'll make sure links to all of those are in our show notes for the episode. If you are listening out there, the show notes are always at jasonfalls.co/ the name of the guest. So in this case, that's jasonfalls.co/ Patrick Hanlon. Patrick, thank you again for the time and wisdom, sir. Hopefully we'll all walk away from this a little more primal.
Grateful to be here. Thanks for having me. Thanks for listening.
I can tell you from firsthand experience, folks, when you force yourself or your company to go through these branding exercises, you unlock something very important to you and your prospective audience, and that is clarity. It's so very powerful. Every time I go through this exercise, even going through it every 6 months or every year for your brand, doing it over again, because things change, audience changes, the conditions in the market change, your goals and aspirations may change a little bit too. So revisiting it, every time I do it, it's like, oh, this unlocks some other idea for me. So check out Primal Branding at primalbranding.co. The book is also called Primal Branding. It's available at amazon.com and wherever you find books. We'll add links to and a link to Patrick's LinkedIn profile in our show notes. That'll be available at jasonfalls.co/ Patrick Hanlon. They'll get you right to the show notes page for this particular episode. If you ever don't remember how to spell the person's name or don't remember the person's name at all, you can go to jasonfalls.com and just click on articles up in the upper corner. That will get you where you need to go to find our episodes and our show notes. If you enjoy Winfluence, please help us grow. Tell somebody about the show. You probably know someone who might want to know more about influence or influence marketing. Send them to winfluencepod.com or share a link to this episode on your social network of choice. If you have a moment, drop Winfluence a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. We are on them all. The show is now on video as well. Just look for Jason Falls Winfluence on YouTube to see the show as well as hear it. Winfluence is a production of Falls & Partners and presented by Scipio.ai. The technical production is by MPN Studios. Winfluence airs along MPN, the Marketing Podcast Network. Thanks for listening, folks. We'll talk again soon on Winfluence.